Local programming on KRWG Public Media made possible in part by viewers like you. Thank you.
Hello and welcome to Fronteras, a Changing America. I'm Anthony Moreno. On this episode, we focus on early childhood education in New Mexico. In the recent midterm election, New Mexico voters approved a constitutional amendment that aims to be a major boost for spending for early childhood education and care programs. We'll discuss the impact that may have later on the program. But first, we'll learn a little bit more about the data on early childhood education in Doña Ana County. This year, the Center for Community Analysis at New Mexico State University released the 2022 Early Childhood Coalition of Doña Ana County Community Needs Assessment Report, which shined light on data and information in the county. Here to share more is Erica Surova, Director and Data Analyst for the Center for Community Analysis at New Mexico State University. Erica, thank you so much for taking the time to talk with us.
Oh, thank you for having me.
Now, I'd like to start off if you could share a little bit about this report and really what it encompassed to learn more about the needs in Doña Ana County.
Sure. We conducted the needs assessment for the Doña Ana County ECE Coalition, Early Childhood Coalition, and that was to really help plan for strategic planning for the next 5 years. And so looking at the data really pre-pandemic to today.
Okay, now there's a lot of information that you're able to find with this report. One of the goals and things that you were looking at was children being born into healthy homes. Now there's been some information about developmental screenings and also finding out more data on why that's important. Can you share with us a little bit more about that?
Sure. Yes, the data showed that approximately 46% of children under the age of 3 had been screened for developmental delays. And really why that is important is because we know that early childhood is, having access to early childhood education really impacts the future of a child. And if there are developmental delays, a lot of times that isn't really seen for a lot of children that don't have exposure until kindergarten. And so that really speaks to why it's important for children to have those screenings at an early age, particularly in those young years when their brain is developing.
Now, how much does health insurance play a role in these screenings happening?
I would say, well, of course, health insurance is very important so that children are getting, access to doctors who can flag those. But even more so, probably in the community when a child is in, say, a Head Start center and they're doing those developmental screenings, professionals can really, they see them day to day, so they might be able to flag something. If a child has a speech delay or some other type of delay, they can connect that family to different types of resources and home visitors as well.
Now you're also finding information about prenatal care available in the county. What did you learn?
So 60% of women had prenatal care in the first trimester, which is really pretty low. The target across in the United States is 80.5%. And so that means we really have to do more to get women access to prenatal care much earlier than they're getting it.
Home visiting was also mentioned in this report. There's been a lot of discussions about improving home visits in the county. What was some of the information you're able to find with that report on home visits?
Yeah, so we found that about 835 families were getting home visiting in the county, and it's not really meeting the estimated need in the county. So there's a formula that people use to estimate the unmet need, and it looks at the number of children that are born every year and then also past births to get a rough estimate. And it showed that about only 27% of the need was really being met in home visiting.
Now, during these home visits, there may be some observations of possible health concerns or maybe even neglect. What was some information that you were able to find on that in terms of child neglect in the area, in the county?
Well, the data shows that there are about 16 cases per 1,000 children. So that's a little over 1,000 children. We're talking young children every year, which, home visiting is one of those programs, like you said, that's might be able to identify that, or even more than identify it, prevent it by giving parents tools to help with parenting, help with stress reduction, and those sorts of things. So that's really the important part of home visiting and how it can have that positive effect on families.
Now, children living in poverty, obviously there's major concern about that, not only in our county, but in the state. What is some information that you're able to provide on that?
So poverty, the official poverty rate for children under 5 is 39%, but typically we look at 200% of the federal poverty level because that's a better measure, because the poverty level right now for a family of 2 is like $18,000 a year. So if you were making $19,000, you might not fall into being in poverty. So for children under 6 years old, it's 66% of children in Doña Ana County are living under 200% of the federal poverty level.
Another goal with this assessment, where you're looking at children being ready for school, being ready for literacy and math, and how many kids were enrolled in early childhood education. Can you provide some information on what were the findings?
Sure. So the data just came out on the kindergarten observation tool, and so it's called the KOT. So that tool, children, when they're entering kindergarten, within the first 60 days of kindergarten, they test them on different literacy rates, math rates, and self and family and physical development. And what it found was only 29% of children were proficient in literacy and in math in the countywide. But even more alarming, we just got some data in disaggregated looking at low-income children compared to children that are not low income, and you see that disparity is about 20 percentage points.
Wow.
Yeah.
There's also been a lot of talk in New Mexico, and in this report, one of the goals was looking at how to support early childhood education and care, the workers in the industry, the staff. They're dealing with children who are coming from diverse backgrounds and dealing with different issues. One of the concerns was how many children that they may be, interacting with that may have ACEs, adverse childhood experiences. What were some of the findings on that?
So this data about adverse childhood experiences, it says that 1 out of every 4 children in New Mexico has had one, and that could be anything from a parent being incarcerated or divorce in the family, child neglect, abuse, that sort of thing. So pretty high compared to the United States.
Now, the state's been taking some steps to try to increase the workforce. There's been a lot of talk about improving pay, making sure we have well-compensated and qualified workers in early childhood education and care. What does the data show in the county with that issue?
Yeah, so as far as pay, the median wage for a early childhood educator or child care worker is around $22,000 a year. So that is alarmingly low. That's one of the lowest wages in the county for any job. And so I know the early childhood education department has been making a lot of efforts to change that. And so there's been programs that you've probably heard about, the pay parity program, to try and raise the income level and pay of these workers, but we definitely have a lot to do in order to get them a better wage.
We only have about a minute left, but addressing having enough qualified teachers in the field and making sure our higher education institutions are getting involved to help with that effort. What's some information we know about that in the county?
Well, we know that definitely the number of students graduating with degrees has declined dramatically in education. Part of that has to do with enrollment. And so that of course, is going to impact the quality of the workforce. And we also have heard from the directors of different community-based centers that they're having a really difficult time recruiting quality workers. And so that's definitely a concern, and I think it's one that the state is well aware of and trying to address, but we still have a lot to do to attract a qualified workforce and make sure that they graduate and get those positions.
Okay, Erica Surova, Director of the Center for Community Analysis at New Mexico State University. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you so much.
To get more insight into the issue, we now hear more from an early childhood education teacher in the southern part of Doña County. Our producer, Evelyn Sandoval, traveled to Anthony, New Mexico to bring us her perspective.
My name is Luz Elena Avila. I'm a toddler teacher, 2 to 3 years old, and my title is a child development teacher. I have 12 years teaching early childhood. I can see the huge difference when I start working in Cricri. The classrooms are divided by centers: block centers, manipulatives, art, music, math, and all the concepts that children need to learn. But it's amazing because they are coming to play. They don't notice when they start learning about the shapes, numbers, or letters. The biggest challenge now is the special needs education, because we notice most of the little ones has problems with speech and hearing, visual. That's why we can see the needs. The staff has to back in college and start learning about all this process. And also can understand how these kids start learning, how they start thinking. It's a little bit different when you are a caregiver or when you are a teacher. Nobody wants to be around for little ones because they think, oh, they are not vaccinated yet, they are exposed with families, and that's another challenge. The state of New Mexico opened scholarships and give us the opportunity to back in college and cover everything in full. Also the parking, the books, the labs, everything. Most of the families receive the budget from the state. Like 90% receive the benefits. State don't help on this budget, probably we have less kids. Now we have like 78 children in the program. We are looking for people who knows the child development, who are ready to teach. Now everybody can do it. Everybody who wants to back in college and get a degree for child development. That's the condition, and that's amazing.
Moving on, we now continue our discussion on early childhood education and care with Lori Martinez, Executive Director with Ngage New Mexico. The organization worked to educate the community on the Constitutional Amendment 1 and why it is needed for young children in our state. Lori, thank you so much for taking the time to talk with us. Now, I brought up Constitutional Amendment 1. Your organization was heavily involved in educating the community about how this question before New Mexico voters could make a difference. Can you kind of share with us a little bit about how this question, which was approved by voters in the recent midterm, will make a difference for early childhood education and care in the state?
Sure, I'd be happy to, and thank you for having me here today. So one thing I think it's important for people to understand is that this passing of the constitutional amendment, it was over a decade-long fight. And so we were involved really just in kind of the final years, but there have been organizations and tons of people over the last decade who have been educating the public, educating legislators, and really working towards this for years and years and years. And then locally in Doña Ana County, we had some community partners like Empowerment Congress in Doña Ana County who knocked on tens of thousands of doors to make sure people understood what the amendment was about. So one thing that's really important for people to understand about the constitutional amendment is that it's a source of recurring funding for early childhood education. And if you've ever listened to our state legislators during session, that's a term that you'll hear over and over and over again, is when they're deciding whether or not to allocate funds to something, is if it's a one-year thing, then you always hear about, well, is it sustainable? And so that's something that's really important for people to understand, is that this funding will go to early childhood services, and it's recurring because the permanent school fund is a recurring source of funding for the state. So in terms of what it can be used for, it's the early childhood department has discretion with that. But there are a number of needs, not just in Doña Ana County, but statewide. One of the big ones is pay parity for childcare providers. A child care provider in Doña Ana County makes about $22,000 a year, which is roughly what you'll make if you're flipping burgers, which is good, honest labor, but also thinking about, like, are we really valuing the people who are taking care of our youngest children? So we already don't have enough child care providers and early childhood education professionals in the state, so that makes it even more important that we are paying them at increased wages. And we also don't have enough child care space in the state. So there's a number, I could go on for a while, but those are just a couple things.
No, I'm glad you brought those up, and I do want to talk about those. But I'd like to hear a little bit more about just how big of an impact this funding is going to make. Obviously, there's been a lot of joy and excitement about the New Mexico budget for the upcoming fiscal year. So when things are good, it looks like this could be a really big impact for early childhood education in terms of just dollars.
Yes, absolutely. We're looking at, remember, this is dependent on our permanent school fund, which at the moment has over $26 billion in it. And so this measure, which started out as purely early childhood, and then when it finally passed our state legislature last year, they changed it a little bit. So now it's meant to benefit early childhood, but then there will also be some funds that will go towards K-12 education. So strictly speaking, for the early childhood part of it, given where the fund's at now, that would be about $150 million a year that goes to the early childhood education and care department. And that's funds that can be used to expand services, anything from early intervention to home visiting to child care services to wages, professional development, recruiting people to the field, which is really understaffed. There's a lot of things that it could be used for in the early childhood ecosystem.
Now, your organization was a part of putting together this assessment for Doña Ana County.
Yes.
This assessment for 2022, the Early Childhood Education Coalition of Doña Ana County Community Needs Assessment. There are three main goals with that, trying to address the needs of children being in healthy homes was one of them. Prenatal care was brought up in that report. Why is this so important, and how can that make a difference?
Sure. Well, prenatal care is one of those things that's sort of always an issue when we talk about early childhood. It's supposed to include prenatal care, but then when you look at the implementation, prenatal care doesn't seem to factor into the funding and the programming as much. So you look at Doña Ana County, and you've got something like 60% of mothers who are getting prenatal care in the first trimester, and there's like 3% who don't get care at all. And so when you're looking at things like children are born into healthy homes or school readiness, it's really important for people to recognize, like, to take that back to the beginning. It doesn't start when the child is born, it starts before. You need to ensure healthy development by making sure that these moms and these families are getting the care that they need leading up.
Another issue you brought up, too, improving equitable access to child care. Now, you mentioned there being a lack of child care facilities, qualified and licensed child care facilities in the state, in the county. What are some things we know about this issue in Doña Ana County?
Well, the pandemic hurt everyone. And so during the pandemic, in that first year, we lost a lot of childcare providers. Some of them shut down permanently, some of them just shut down temporarily. In Doña Ana County, something that's distinct here is that New Mexico allows two types of childcare providers. You can either be a licensed center, which is usually what people are familiar with, or you can become a provider out of your home, to provide childcare out of your home. And if you do that, you can be either registered or licensed. Doña Ana County, with regards to our childcare centers, not surprisingly, during the pandemic, we lost providers, but then that bounced back up. So right now, we're roughly at the same amount of licensed centers that we were when the pandemic hit. But home providers, Doña Ana County is more dependent on home childcare providers than any other county in the state, at least before the pandemic it was. And what we saw with home providers is that just in the last 2 years, our number of home providers has done this. So some of them closed down, but we're seeing some that closed down and stayed closed down, or just stopped providing care altogether, or they stopped doing it through the state. So that's a huge loss for our county.
Now I want to move on and talk about another goal in the assessment, being having children ready for school. Now, as far as higher quality education programs for early childhood education and care programs, what are we looking at in the county?
That's a big question, because there's a lot of things. When you look at, children are ready for school, when kids start kindergarten, they're assessed on something called the KOT, the Kindergarten Observation Tool, and that's a measure we use for when kids are coming in. It looks at things like literacy and math and other domains, and looks at where they're at. And so in areas like literacy and math, we've got in Doña Ana County about a third of kids coming in under what we would call school ready. And so when you look at the entire early childhood ecosystem, you can see things like we don't have enough childcare providers in general, particularly now for kids under the age of 3. Because there have been some really good things in New Mexico. Lots of funding has gone towards pre-K, which has been phenomenal. There's so much more increased access there, but that's 3 and 4-year-olds. But what's happened along with that has been that we don't have as many spots available for kids who are 2 and under. So you're looking at not only childcare services, but also other services that are meant to impact the birth to 3 years. And all of that builds towards school readiness too. So early intervention, home visiting, parent education programs, prenatal care, they're all connected.
Now, the third goal in this assessment, supporting early childhood workforce, you mentioned one of the issues there is having a fair wage, a living wage for folks working in the industry, and support for job security. One other thing that was brought up in this assessment was having bilingual teachers in early childhood education. How big of an issue is that?
Yes, well, when you look at in Doña Ana County, when you've got something like 49% of homes speak a language other than English, it becomes a big thing. It's also a huge opportunity lost when you look at our home providers, for example, in the childcare arena. Many of them are women, many are Spanish speaking. And when you look at the ability for us to grow our own, right? Like this is an area where we could really be working to resolve our own problems locally. But these providers, 95% of whom are women, they hit a wall when you can only take so many classes in early childhood that only reach up to a certain level. You get to a point where they can't do anymore, right? And so we need, when you look at the needs in our area and the diversity and what is the makeup of our people here, then our educational opportunities should match that.
Now, your group has been heavily involved with the community, getting feedback from the community on this issue as well. Just getting education out there for folks to know that there is support available for funding for early childhood education, and perhaps workers in the field to go back to school and get funding as well. How big of a challenge is that? We only have about a minute left, but just how big of a challenge is that?
Public awareness is always a challenge, and we wrestle with that because there's a lot of information, there's a lot of supports available, but that information isn't always getting out to families in a way that they can receive it. Or things will happen and they happen fast, or the rules will be confusing. So one good example is that in the last year, childcare was made essentially free for most families in New Mexico. That's something that we absolutely want to keep in place, but in the meantime, it's imperative we get that information out to families. So that's where we see a real disconnect, is between services available and having it reach families in a meaningful way.
Lori Martinez is Executive Director of Ngage New Mexico. Lori, thank you so much for taking the time to talk with us.
Thank you for having me.
That's it for this week's episode. You can view past episodes on Fronteras, Changing America by subscribing to our KRWG News YouTube channel. And you can also stay updated with news anytime at our website, krwg.org. Thank you for joining us this week. I'm Anthony Moreno. We'll see you next time.